Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, ich darf Sie ganz herzlich zu unserem Webinar Aktuelles aus den USA begrüßen. Mein Name ist Lukas Zitz, ich bin der Wirtschaftsdelegierte Stellvertreter hier am Außenwirtschaftscenter New York und gemeinsam mit Brett Ryan, Senior US Economist der Deutsche Bank und Nicholas Galbraith, einem Zollrechtsexperten und Partner bei der Anwaltskanzlei Barnes Thornburg, möchten wir Sie heute durch die aktuellen Themen der USA führen und mit Ihnen besprechen, wie die nächsten Schritte für Ihr Unternehmen in den USA aussehen können unter den aktuellen Rahmenbedingungen. Wir haben kurzfristig jetzt eine Änderung vorgenommen in der Agenda. Brett Ryan wird als erster sprechen, weil in einer halben Stunde der US Treasury Secretary eine Ansprache geben wird und daraus wichtige Ableitungen getroffen werden, bei der er zuhören möchte. Deswegen werde ich jetzt auch auf Englisch wechseln. Dear Brett, thank you very much for joining our webinar. We have already 350 participants in the room, and I would like you to share your presentation and start with your input.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for having me today, everybody. As Lucas mentioned, we do have the Treasury Secretary speaking at 10 o'clock, and it's a big focus for the markets at the moment, given kind of a lot of the volatility that we've seen over the last several weeks in the wake of the tariff announcements. And so, I think the best place to start is in our latest outlook piece is tariff struck, as you can see, and if anybody listens to AC/DC, thunderstruck is certainly the way that I think markets took the tariff announcements. I think everybody thought that they understood sort of the game that the Trump administration was playing coming into this year. Okay, we're going to get some tariffs. A 10% baseline tariff would be disruptive, but not massively so. And then the announcements on April 2 obviously were well beyond what anybody expected, with even the Fed, and it really threw doubts of confidence in this administration. But just to give you an idea of where we currently stand with tariffs, we're looking at a tariff rate of 26% all in. And that's with China, Canada, Mexico. So even though Trump has put a 90-day pause on the additional tariffs to countries, just the fact that you have China at such a high level keeps that overall tariff rate at 25%, right around 25%. And this is basically the highest tariff rate going back to 1910. And this is obviously a huge tax, and the way we were thinking about it coming into the year is that we were going to get the positives from upcoming tax reform that the U.S. is doing, Congress is considering right now, would outweigh the negatives from tariffs and trade. But that situation is unfortunately reversed, and given the trade policy uncertainty that we have here, I mean, record levels of trade policy uncertainty, the damage is likely, there's likely that there's going to be some damage already done to the growth outlook, because simply, these types of massive shocks, cause huge disruptions, as I'm sure you all know, to your businesses, to your supply chains, and you're spending an inordinate amount of time trying to understand the complexities of this, and instead of trying to grow your businesses, expand your markets, etc., and allocate capital. So that uncertainty in and of itself, even if tariff rates are going to come back down later this year, this uncertainty in itself is already causing loss of output. And it shows up in less CapEx, and it shows up in less consumer spending. So in terms of, we put out our latest outlook last week, And we see real GDP growth in the back half of the year really getting hit by this trade uncertainty. And our previous work around this has indicated that it could subtract about a percentage point or more within a very relatively short time from growth. And so we've lowered our forecast this year from 2.5% real GDP growth to just 0.9%. And that now has the unemployment rate moving to 4.6%. At the same time, we are expecting higher inflation, unfortunately. And you can see financial conditions have tightened noticeably over the past several months. This is the Fed's Financial Conditions Index. We've replicated it on a daily basis. Financial conditions were accommodative, and now they've moved to a tighter financial conditions. Again, this all has an impact on the growth outlook for the next couple of quarters. And really, asset prices matter for consumer spending. The hit to equity markets, when you think about a simple model of consumer spending and wealth effects, real disposable income growth is what tends to drive consumer spending. But asset prices do matter. And in our models, the net wealth to income ratio is significant. And if you had modeled consumer spending last year and assumed that equity prices were flat, you would have had a percentage point less of consumer spending. And this model has done a good job of previously in terms of predicting consumer spending. So, as a result, we've lowered our outlook over the back half of the year. From tax reform, this is the next thing that the administration is going to need to really pivot towards. What they want to do at the end of the day is make the U.S. a destination for production and a destination for corporations and very business friendly, right? So, coming into the year, you had a lot of enthusiasm around deregulation, around tax reform, additional tax cuts. And here, we're showing that the tax cuts that we expect on top of the TCJA extension. Remember, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act is expiring next year, so Congress needs to address that. But the additional things that we expect are expansion of the child tax credit, a SALT cap raise. This is less important for non-U.S. people, but importantly, a cut to the corporate tax rate to about 15%. You've also have an increase in defense and border spending that's up front. Now, the question is, do they do that much in spending cuts? And we've penciled in about $100 billion in spending cuts, most likely focused around Medicaid. But I think that's probably a upper bound. I'd say it's probably going to end up being less. The problem here is the tariff revenue. So you add up all the positives from the tax stuff, it's not being offset by the negatives from tariff revenue under the current assumptions. And so those things have to come down. And I think you're going to end up most likely with a 10% baseline tariff. I think that's where we're going to end up here eventually. I think we will definitely avoid the more aggressive onerous tariffs that Trump had sort of rolled out on April 2nd. Obviously, I think the administration is learning from the market here and taking, and I think has gotten the message at this point. But we can't be with Trump. Uncertainty is sort of his trade. CapEx future plans and a lot of the regional Fed surveys have already taken a hit and retraced some of the positive feelings coming out of the election. And we've cut our growth forecast meaningfully over the back half of this year, and we're looking at growth that's close to flat. I mean, going into the prior to the trade shock, payrolls were looking good, the labor market was looking okay. However, it's a situation in the U.S. where the hiring rate is very low, so labor demand is low. The reason why you still have positive payrolls is because of a very low layoff rate. And this is an unusual situation historically. Usually when the hiring rate comes down, layoff rate goes up. This time the Fed had pretty much managed to engineer a soft landing, and that was that to their credit, not many, including ourselves, thought that they would be able to do it with inflation. No evidence of any sort of Doge layoffs that have been talked about spilling over to the broader labor market at this point. But because we lowered our GDP growth forecast over the back half of the year, we think unemployment rate is going to rise a bit to possibly 4.6% by the end of this year. Here's the really bad effect of tariffs on inflation. And absent all of the tariffs, we would have been expecting core inflation, core PC inflation closer to 2.5%. But you start to add these things in, and this on the left side you have 50% pass through to consumers, and the right side is 75% pass through. So you in the worst case scenario, you could see core inflation north of 5% this year, and that is a terrible combination for the U.S. And this is exactly what markets have been reacting to. And it makes it difficult for the Fed to ease, and it puts the Fed in a very difficult position, as Chair Powell has talked about. They can't cut until they see clear signs of a labor market slowdown, given the inflation backdrop. They haven't gotten back to their inflation target yet, and they are very concerned. The longer you're away from the inflation target, the more they become concerned about inflation expectations. And that's the number one job of a central bank, is to make sure inflation expectations remain in check. And so from a CPI perspective, we now see CPI rising to core CPI to 4% by the end of this year as well. And that's really most on core goods prices. So, these are how policy rules would kind of think for the Fed, how they would respond to these impacts. Real GDP growth slowing in 0.8 to 1.5, along with an unemployment rate of 4.5 to 5.0. We're at 4.6, and then core PCE at these levels. Taylor rule would tell you should be anywhere from where you are now to higher on the interest rate, whereas a balanced approach rule, which the Fed has tended to follow, would indicate the potential, for some cuts. And so we've built in one Fed cut by the end of this year, and then 2 more in the first quarter of next year. But so, this is the Fed's inflation expectations index, which is really, one of the things that they look at in terms of, judging whether longer-term inflation expectations are remaining in check. So, that's sort of the summary, is that the damage has sort of been done here. Now, where are we going in terms of the tariffs? The administration is cannot go back to this, reciprocal rates of 20%, et cetera, on Europe and whatnot. And I think the key question is, what's the incentive for other countries to negotiate at this point? They know that the market will punish the administration severely if they follow through in 90 days. And come July 8th, why would large U.S. trading partners feel any pressing need to do so, to seal deals? Now, I think the bar for quote unquote a trade deal is somewhat lowered here, and I think the administration needs to show some wins or some signs that this approach is yielding results, or else Congress might get concerned. And to think about tariffs in one sense, tariffs are in a way tied to the tax bill, because Trump needed to raise tariffs to get revenue on the board, to ease passage of the tax bill in a very slim majority in the House, slightly larger majority in the Senate, but he has a very slim majority as party in the House. The problem is he went way overboard relative to what market expectations were. And now you have a situation where, remember, he needs to pass. All this needs to pass before the midterms next year, and the longer that the economy is at risk, you're going to have Congress start to worry about their jobs at the midterm elections next year, and that's where Trump could lose the House. So the strategy this year, coming into the year, was okay. Let's, I'm going to do some of the negative trade stuff up front because I need to get tariff revenue on the board to help pass some more tax cuts. The market may take a little bit of a hit, but then I'm going to come riding to the rescue with a tax bill over the summer, and I would expect this tax bill to pass sometime in July, likely late July. And then hopefully maybe the Fed starts to ease towards the end of the year, and you could ride that sort of market wave into the midterms in November 2026. Remember, Trump needs the stock market peaking in November 2026. He doesn't need the stock market peaking now. The problem with that strategy is it's extremely dangerous. And once you start like a kinetic war, and once a trade war starts, things can quickly spiral out of control, as we're currently seeing. And that's the overarching problem here, is that, Trump is always coy about what are his aims in these negotiations, and the goalposts seem to constantly change. But I think Trump has shown in the past that he is receptive to signals from the market when he's overdone it, and I think that they seem to have gotten the message. Hopefully, we'll hear some more positives from the Treasury Secretary in about 10 minutes. So I'll stop there. Thanks again for having me, and we're always happy to help with any questions.
Perfect. Brett, thank you so much for the great insights. I have seen in the chat room that there's a number of questions. However, I noticed that they're more related to the tariffs. At this point, we would like to take questions specifically regarding the economic outlook. Victoria, do we have any of those?
I mean, I could also answer questions on tariffs too.
Yeah.
Plenty of. Yeah, sure.
Perfect. Victoria, I will. I think she sent it to me in the chat. So one question is, are there custom tariffs numbers that are generally exempt from U.S. custom duties? I think that might be something we're going to touch with Nicholas, except for that is something you were fully into as well.
Just repeat that again. Sorry.
Are there custom tariff numbers that are generally exempt from U.S. custom duties, maybe imported duty-free? Maybe that is something you can touch upon from an economic perspective. Why are there some exempted?
Yeah, so just from a general overview, the thing about tariffs is you're always playing whack-a-mole, right? Like he had to tariff. If you wanted to get revenue, number one, you needed to tariff your biggest trading partners, the EU, Canada, Mexico, and China. And two, you have a constant problem of, if China, one of the bigger issues you have is that the U.S. wants to address is Chinese goods getting in through the supply chain through Mexico and Canada, Mexico more so, where you have Chinese factories literally on the ground in Mexico getting into the supply chain. Because what it turns into is a game of whack-a-mole, right? Like you reflag the ships, you change the HTS codes to try to get around things. And so that's why a 10% baseline tariff just it made the most sense. It's the easiest way to address this problem. But Trump, tends to think that it gives him negotiating leverage with certain countries, and there may be other strategic aims in his negotiations. Obviously, not all of this is very rational and logical, put it that way.
Yeah. One more question for you regarding rationality of tariffs in that sense. One viewer is asking, when can we expect some indication about like feasible tariff rates, like some that we can actually calculate with? Now, well, that I guess is an impossible question to answer right away.
Yeah.
You could maybe share your point of view. What would be rational from the administration's perspective, as you touched upon the topic of when the stock market should reach a certain level?
Yeah, so I would say that what we're going to end up with most likely, and this is from talking to politicians in DC as well, is likely 10% baseline tariff. Like that's likely where we're going to end up. When are you going to know that? It's difficult to say. I think there's still beginning some carve outs for higher tariffs for national security stuff. But I would say within the 90-day window, so July 8th, I believe, is when the 90-day reprieve, ends. I think that's where we're going to end. Where we're going to end for that. Steel and aluminum, that's a more difficult one because that's not a national emergency. That's a Section 232. And listen, the national emergency, and I'm sure Nicholas can talk more about this, the legal rules around this. I mean, the bottom line is that you need 2/3 majorities in Congress to overturn the national emergency. That's not happening now, given that Congress's the Republican Party controls both houses. But if these guys see a threat to their reelection next year, the longer this goes on, they can turn on Trump. But we're not at that point yet. I would say that point might be reached if there's nothing to show on all this trade, uncertainty and trade actions. If Trump has nothing to show in terms of a trade deal, come 90 days from now, Congress might get nervous and start to push back on him. But as of right now, I think they're going to let him run. They're letting him run with it.
Thank you so much, Brett, for sharing. We are finishing 5 minutes ahead of the Treasury Secretary meeting. And yeah, thank you very much.
Much appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to directly continue with Nicholas. Nicholas, could you please share your screen and continue with your presentation?
Yes, thank you, Lucas. And thank you to Advantage Austria for hosting this. So very quickly, my name is Nick Galbraith with Barnes & Thornburg. We are a full-service national law firm in the U.S., and we do have a European services practice group. And my practice in particular, in my group, we do international trade, which means we, of course, touch on U.S. customs and tariff issues, and that has been a big focus lately. But we also provide other trade services such as export controls, sanctions, foreign direct investment in the U.S., etc. And of course, a caveat is that this is a public non-confidential forum. So as we go through the Q&A later, please don't provide any confidential information, and anything I am providing is not legal advice. So I am going to discuss kind of understanding the current overview of where we are with the tariffs, and then how you as an Austrian company should start looking at your customs and tariff analysis. And then we'll also cover potential mitigation strategies for perhaps reducing or avoiding some of these tariffs. So where we are today, I think, first of all, the big caveat is that this is changing all very quickly. And so this is just a snapshot of where we are today. And the reason it's changing quickly is because a lot of it is occurring under President Trump's authority under the International Emergencies Economic Powers Act, which allows him to regulate international trade in response to a declared national emergency. I think Brett touched on this a little bit earlier. And because of that, things can change at the drop of a hat with the issuance of an executive order, which means, from day to day, there's a lot of uncertainty. In addition to that law I'm talking about, which I'll just shorthand as IEEPA, there have also been tariffs imposed under other U.S. laws, such as Section 301, which gets at countries that are implementing unfair trade practices, and Section 232, which is also national security related, but it's more of a process and an investigation process than what's happening under IEEPA. So where we are right now is, well, let's start with what we care about the most for Austrian companies, which is that 10% baseline tariff. As everyone knows, there was an announcement that additional reciprocal tariffs were going to be imposed, but they've been suspended for 90 days. And when we're looking at these tariffs, what we're concerned about is where an import is a product of, otherwise known as its country of origin. In addition to that baseline tariff, for China, are specialized tariffs. There is a 125% tariff under IEEPA, but these can be stacked with other tariffs like Section 301 tariffs talked about earlier, and these other IEEPA tariffs. So the reciprocal tariffs emergency had to do with the trade deficit. There were also national emergencies declared with respect to fentanyl and other drugs supposedly coming over the border from Canada or Mexico or from through China as well. And that's where there were some initial tariffs placed on Mexico, Canada, and China. Currently, those sit at 20% for goods of China and 25% for goods of Mexico and Canada, with some exceptions for energy and potash. And the key but here is, to the extent the goods qualify under the trade deal with the US, Mexico, and Canada called USMCA, they can still enter duty-free, at least as it stands today. Another key thing I would say about this 10% baseline tariff is there are some exceptions to it. So for instance, if a good is subject to the steel, aluminum, or derivatives, Section 232, then the 10% duty is not also applicable. The same thing with certain auto and auto parts tariffs that are imposed as well. There's also an annex to the executive order that contains certain goods that are exempted, like certain coppers, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, and other electronics. That have been exempted from it as well. I think a key thing to think about here is what's going to happen after the 90 days. Of course, we certainly just do not know. And the Trump administration is difficult to predict. But the proposed tariff for the EU was 20%. We could see increased tariffs on July 9th, but we shall see what sort of deal might be struck by then. But we note that there are also other potential tariffs that haven't even been implemented yet that could be based on announced investigations or intended investigations related to pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, lumber, copper, and others. And I should also just note very quickly that there was a February 21 memo directing the U.S. Trade Representative to consider renewing a Section 301 investigation related to digital services taxes, and Austria was specifically mentioned there. I want to also go over quickly why a lot of folks, including legal professionals like me, can't often tell you immediately how the tariffs are going to work. And that's because what we've been seeing happening is there is an announcement, often via President Trump's Truth Social account or some sort of press conference, that certain tariffs are going to take place and be implemented. But then there is a delay until we actually see any text of an order. Typically what you see then is the executive order itself, which lays it out and provides more information, as well as a White House fact sheet typically. Often, though, we've seen, particularly when there have been exemptions or the tariffs are implemented via HTS tariff line, that the annexes to the executive orders are not immediately available and aren't actually available until a Federal Register notice is published. And then from there, customs will further provide guidance in the form of operational instructions that let you know how to enter your goods, what lines they're going to come under, and how to implement certain exceptions, like if you have a aluminum derivative and you're only paying the duty on the aluminum content of that aluminum derivative. In addition, CBP has been issuing certain frequently asked questions on their website, but again, those are kind of slow to come and a little bit hit or miss as well. So if you're considering how is this all going to apply to you, here are some questions that you need to start considering. So for your transactions with the US, which party acts as the US importer of record? That's a key question because that's the party who's actually going to be entering the goods into the US and paying the duty. Importantly on that as well, when we're talking about these tariffs, we're talking about entries for consumption, which is a term of art under customs law. So certain types of temporary imports may not be subject to the duty, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. You're also going to want to just, generally understand what are all your items, what is the value of them on an annual basis, and what HTS codes are you using, what country of origin are we using. You're also going to want to look at your history and see whether or not you have been subject to any customs reviews in the past. For instance, if you are the importer or your US subsidiary is the importer, they want to be on top of whether or not they're receiving what's known as a CF-28 or CF-29 from customs. And this is when they're reaching out to ask about particular entries. If you ever receive one of those, I highly recommend reaching out to outside counsel, because what we see happen is the first response doesn't necessarily get at what customs is looking for, and it can cause a lot of headaches down the road. So from there, I just want to, given the time, I'm not going to go through all these slides with any great detail, but briefly touch on some of these topics. So when you enter a good into the US, you of course have to enter it under a particular tariff classification line. So one thing that you could review as you're going through this is, do you have the correct tariff? And this is particularly important in the event that you think you might fall under an exception. Like we talked about earlier, or if you're looking at aluminum or steel derivatives or auto parts as well. You can't just change it because you want to get a lower duty, but you could look at it and see if legitimately you've been using the wrong code, or if there's an argument for why you might be able to use another code. And this can affect also just the general rate of duty, because these duties we're talking about are in addition to the general rate of duty. Another key thing to consider is, what is the value of the good that's being entered into the US? This is a very, very complicated area of US customs law. Generally speaking, the preferred value by customs is the transaction value. In other words, what was the price actually paid for the good that's being imported? But there are times when you cannot use that value. For instance, if you have an Austrian parent selling to its US subsidiary, then that's a related party transaction, and there are very complicated rules about whether or not you can use the transaction value between the parent and the subsidiary. Some things to consider, though, under these tariffs is, for instance, under this 10% IEEPA tariff, you can reduce the duties owed based on the US origin material. So to the extent that 20% or more of the value of that item is US origin, you could look at that and see if you can reduce the duty that you owe. Also, if you're importing something that's on the derivative steel or aluminum product list, you wouldn't pay the duty only on the steel or aluminum value and not the overall good. So that's something to look into as well. Another valuation issue is, there's something called the first sale rule. So if there is a multi-tiered transaction, you may want to look into whether or not you can take advantage of this. An example would be, for instance, if an Austrian parent company is buying a good from a factory in India and then selling that on to its US subsidiary, you might be able to use that first transaction value rather than the later one. And that is an area to consider. As I mentioned, you also need to consider the country of origin of the good, because that's how it's determined whether or not which particular IEEPA tariff applies. And generally speaking, that's going to be the country where the good was last substantially transformed. So if you're considering, moving production to a third country, you really want to think about how this would apply in advance rather than just assuming it will be substantially transformed. And speaking of which, I should also mention that if you are considering moving production in the US, you should also think about how the tariffs on any parts and components you have to import will affect any savings you might have. There are other exemptions from the IEEPA tariffs, including certain provisions of Chapter 98. So for instance, if articles are going to be exported and improved or advanced and then returned back to the US, you might be able to take advantage of some of those chapters. For each one of these executive orders set up different rules, are not necessarily consistent on some of the availability of these exemptions, but for the 10% IEEPA tariff, that sort of baseline tariff, they did allow for duty drawback. So that is also something to consider as well. And then foreign trade zones have been limited under the IEEPA tariffs and the benefits that you're going to be able to get under those. You could potentially defer the duty by importing it into a foreign trade zone, but unless you're going to export the items, you're not really currently, as it's structured, going to be able to eliminate the duties on the parts or components you're importing. And then, of course, there is the possibility of lobbying, though currently there is no general process for seeking exemptions from these duties, unlike we saw under the first Trump administration with the Section 301 duties. You should, of course, consider what terms you're putting into your contracts and how broadly you're drafting your force majeure clauses, to allow for changes based on economic hardship, etc. So, I think given the time, I'll stop there and hopefully be able to address anything additional in the Q&As.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. Yeah, for the audience, how we are going to proceed is we are going to try to answer the questions from the audience to you. And afterwards, we have also prepared a status quo of the situation, how we perceive it from the Austrian perspective. We have talked to a lot of Austrian companies and asked for their opinion, and that's also something that I would like to share with you afterwards. And also we are going to provide specific ideas on how you can deal with the current situation based on what we are experiencing every day in the interaction with Austrian companies. To go through the questions real quick, so we have a question here regarding the USMCA compliant shipments to the US are tariff exempt. Is there a law to confirm this will remain this way, or could this be changed with an executive order?
That's a very good question, and the answer is currently it could be changed with an executive order. Originally the tariff was imposed against Canada and Mexico 25% across the board. Then it was suspended. Then it was reimposed for a couple days, and after a couple of days, the exception via executive order was put in there for USMCA compliant goods. Perfect. So just as quickly as it was implemented, it can be taken away.
Okay. One more question. We offer services for customers in the US. The services are performed in Austria. These are currently subject to withholding tax, but this can be avoided by using Form W8. Do we have to expect any changes here?
I would say that that's a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. That's not really a customs or tariff issue. So
it's more of a tax situation. Yeah,
exactly. So I don't want to speak to that.
Absolutely. We have one more question here regarding steel. if we end up with a baseline 10% tariff, what's going to happen to Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum? Is there a chance for a comeback of exclusions and or free quotas?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So just kind of returning to the structure at the moment, the current baseline 10% tariff under IEEPA specifically exempts goods that are currently subject to the Section 232 steel and aluminum duties. So if you have an item that falls under those duties, you don't also pay the additional 10%. You pay the duty that's due for the Section 232. I would, can't predict exactly how this administration is going to go forward, but those have been long-standing duties, even though they were expanded on derivative products recently. And so I would anticipate those are more likely, perhaps than others, to be maintained overall. And to the extent they continue to be implemented, we could see another exemption process. So far the administration has not really announced how that would work for any of these tariffs, but because it did happen in the past, it certainly is possible we could see it in the future.
Yeah. And one last question, what is the percentage of the value of a product as to be considered made in the US? And in order to not be affected by tariffs, how is this calculated? Where can one find more information about it?
Yep, absolutely. So you have to have a minimum of 20% US content under these IEEPA tariffs in order for you to be able to reduce the value of the duty you're paying. So for instance, if you're bringing in an Austrian good and 20% or more of it is US content, then you don't pay duties on that percentage. You don't get rid of the duty overall, you reduce the amount of duty that you're paying. And so for more information on that, you can of course reach out to me, but there's also certain customs cargo messaging systems that sort of explain a little bit more about how to do that as well.
Okay. Nicholas, thank you so much. Given the time, I think I will continue with our presentation in German. Please follow if you would like to. Otherwise, I'd like to thank you at this point for these great insights and looking forward to working together with you in the future as well.
Great. Likewise. Thank you, Lucas. Thank you to Advantage Austria, and good to talk to everybody.
Ich werde an dieser Stelle wieder auf Deutsch wechseln und wir möchten Ihnen gerne noch die Einblicke mitgeben, also die Eindrücke, die wir über die letzten Wochen gesammelt haben. Sie können sich vorstellen, dass bei uns sehr viele Anfragen über E-Mail, Telefon zu uns kommen, zu den Zöllen und zur allgemeinen Marktsituation. Wir arbeiten mit österreichischen Firmen, die bereits lange in die USA investiert sind, die in die USA exportieren und Firmen, die auch erst dabei sind zu überlegen, ob der US-Markt für sie der richtige Markt ist. Und dazu habe ich jetzt noch einige Minuten an Informationen für Sie. Ich starte gleich direkt mit einem Screenshot aus dem Guardian und einer Information, die gestern verkündet wurde, die in dieser sehr schwer zu durchsehbaren Situation geteilt wurde. Nämlich hat die Regierung, Präsident Trump konkret, verkündet, dass die Zölle auf importierte Güter von dem Level von 145% in Bezug auf China massiv gesenkt werden könnten. Was das genau bedeutet, weiß man nicht. Allerdings ist das wiederum ein Beweis dafür, dass in der aktuellen Situation nichts in Stein gemeißelt ist und sich noch viele, viele Dinge ändern können, was für uns natürlich bedeutet, dass wir weiterhin österreichische Firmen dabei unterstützen möchten, sich den US-Markt proaktiv anzuschauen, um hier aktiv zu werden und aktiv zu bleiben. Und warum wir das tun, möchte ich noch mal kurz erläutern und Ihnen einige Einblicke aus unserer Arbeit mitgeben, die für Sie sehr wertvoll sein können. Grundsätzlich ist die Handelsbeziehung zwischen den USA und der Europäischen Union eine der größten weltweit mit einem Handelsvolumen von 1,2 Billionen $. Und das Wachstum, das in den USA in vielen Bereichen vorhanden ist, ist vor allem für österreichische Firmen sehr relevant. Hier rechts unten habe ich markiert oder hervorgehoben die Wachstumssektoren, die besonders stark waren in den letzten Jahren, nämlich elektronische Komponenten, industrielle Ausrüstung und Automobilzuliefererteile, eben jene Teile, jene Industrien, die für unsere österreichischen Firmen besonders wichtig sind. Hier habe ich auch nochmal eine kurze Karte aufgezeigt, um zu veranschaulichen, wo unsere Firmen aktiv sind. Wir haben rund 950 österreichische Niederlassungen in den USA. Ein Drittel davon sind Produktionsstätten und die Direktinvestitionen Österreichs sind auch über die letzten Jahre stark am Steigen. Man sieht hier einen ganz klaren Trend aufgrund der Attraktivität des US-Marktes für Investitionen, aber auch für Exporte. Auch das Exportvolumen ist über die letzten Jahre konstant gestiegen und glücklicherweise haben wir viele österreichische Firmen, die am US-Markt sehr erfolgreich arbeiten und auch viele, die neu in den Markt eintreten. Und das zeichnet sich natürlich in dieser Handelsbilanz wieder. Kurz, warum sind österreichische Firmen in den USA erfolgreich? Was sind die Erfolgsfaktoren? Für viele unserer Firmen ist der große Vorteil, dass sie in einer sehr tiefen Nische operieren, in der es wenig Konkurrenz gibt, bei der es dann auch eine elastischere Nachfrage gibt und Alternativen eigentlich oft überhaupt nicht oder nur in schlechterer Qualität verfügbar sind. Die hohe Serviceorientierung ist auch etwas, was wir als eines der Markenzeichen unserer Firmen sehen, die hier am US-Markt realisieren. Und das starke Qualitätsversprechen ist ein ganz starkes USP. Die Herausforderungen am aktuellen US-Markt sind natürlich, dass es einen Preiswettbewerb gibt und eine hohe Marktdynamik. Die unsichere Situation hinsichtlich der Handelsbarrieren wird sich auch noch eine Weile halten. Allerdings langfristig, wenn man sich die letzten Jahrzehnte auch mit den USA ansieht, ist es ein Handel zwischen zwei Handelsräumen, der sehr stabil und in einem rechtlich sehr geordneten Rahmen verlaufen ist. Und man kann definitiv davon ausgehen, dass langfristig auch wieder so eine Situation eintreten wird. Wenn man in den US-Markt eintritt, gibt es natürlich auch hohe Markteintrittskosten. Was bedeutet das? Konkretes Beispiel ist, wenn man noch nicht in den USA verkauft, aber hier mit einem Vertrieb starten möchte, dann sind auch oft die Kosten schon für den ersten Vertriebsmitarbeiter relativ hoch. Das liegt daran, dass die Gehaltsstrukturen in den USA anders sind. Auf der positiven Seite bedeutet das aber auch, dass die Margen für österreichische Produkte hier auf diesem Markt sehr gut sind und somit es ein attraktiver Markt ist aus der Perspektive. Und eine Herausforderung ist natürlich auch, in nicht allen Branchen ist man die einzige Firma, sondern es gibt auch Konkurrenz. Und das ist eine Herausforderung. US-Konkurrenten, die etablierte Netzwerke haben, sind in manchen Bereichen im Vorteil. Das ist etwas, was man sich beim Markteintritt und bei der weiteren Bearbeitung des Marktes überlegen muss. Wir haben auch nochmal aufgezeigt, welche Möglichkeiten gibt es denn überhaupt, neben dem Export an sich in den US-Markt einzutreten, beziehungsweise wenn der Export bereits funktioniert, was man zusätzlich tun kann. Das eine sind natürlich Direktinvestitionen mit einer eigenen Niederlassung oder einer Akquisition in den USA. Tatsächlich ist es so, dass ein zunehmender Teil österreichischer Firmen sich dafür interessiert, sogenannte Brownfield-Investments durchzuführen und bestehende Strukturen aufzukaufen mit einer Produktion und mit bestehenden auch Kundenstrukturen. Wenn eines dieser beiden Themen für Sie interessant ist, das sind Themen, bei denen das Außenwirtschaftscenter Sie gerne unterstützt und passende Partner findet, um so eine Akquisition durchzuführen. Die Vorteile sind klar, dass man eine vollständige Kontrolle natürlich über so eine Niederlassung dann hat, eine Nähe zum Kunden, ein Made in USA-Logo, das etwas ist, was bei vielen Firmen zunehmend an Bedeutung gewinnt. Wir bekommen die Rückmeldung, dass Made in USA ein definitives Verkaufsargument in bestimmten Branchen ist. Der Schritt unter der direkten Investition ist die Lizenzierung. Das bedeutet, man vergibt Rechte an einen US-Partner, was natürlich mit einem geringeren Risiko einhergeht, einen schnelleren Markteintritt ermöglicht und Einnahmen durch eine Lizenzgebühr ermöglicht. Und der Schritt darunter ist noch einmal eine Vertriebs- und Produktionspartnerschaft, bei der man mit einem etablierten US-Partner zusammenarbeitet. Auch dabei sind wir gern behilflich, so einen passenden Partner für Sie zu finden. Nikolaus hat in seiner vorherigen Präsentation schon angesprochen, die Situation ist sehr unüberschaubar und Fast täglich gibt es neue Schlagzeilen rund um die US-Zölle. Wir haben hier sozusagen die Trump-Trade-Timeline nochmal aufgezeichnet, die nochmal ganz kurz veranschaulichen soll. Wir haben am 4. Februar des Jahres eine Ankündigung gehabt zu neuen Zöllen auf chinesische Waren. Am 4. März gab es dann Ankündigungen zu Zollveränderungen in Mexiko und Kanada. Das zieht sich dann weiter bis da gehe ich gleich auf die nächste Folie, bis zum heutigen Tag, eben mit beispielsweise der gestrigen Ankündigung, dass die Zölle auf chinesische Waren vielleicht doch nicht so hoch ausfallen würden, aber doch erhöht werden. Ich glaube, dass das Motto für die nächsten Wochen ist wahrscheinlich auf gut österreichisch, schauen wir mal, was sich tut. Letztendlich könnte es auch so sein, dass nach den 90 Tagen das Endresultat ist, dass es keine substanzielle Zollerhöhung gibt. Und was ich Ihnen damit mitgeben möchte, ist, dass man im Anbetracht der zahlreichen Schlagzeilen einfach ein positives Bild beibewahren sollte, eben aufgrund dessen, dass die Handelsbeziehung zwischen Österreich und den USA wunderbar funktioniert, seit Jahren wächst und langfristig dabei auch ein weiterer positiver Trend zu vermuten ist. Wir haben jetzt für Sie auch noch einige Stimmen österreichischer Firmen eingefangen, um aufzuzeigen, wie denn das Bild hier vor Ort ist, auch für jene der Unternehmen, die noch nicht am US-Markt aktiv sind. Einerseits haben wir mit einem Logistikunternehmen gesprochen, sozusagen eine Firma, die eben tagtäglich direkt mit der Abwicklung von Waren beschäftigt ist. Und dabei haben wir hier ein direktes Zitat von Daniel Bokerschnik von der Firma Jerich aus der Steiermark, der sagt, die derzeitige Situation erinnert ihn sehr an die Pandemie, wo anfänglich sehr viele große Aufträge storniert wurden. Letztendlich war es dann aber so, dass jene Firmen, die weiterhin am Ball geblieben sind, erfolgreich weiter am US-Markt absetzen konnten. Und zusätzlich haben auch Seefrachter jetzt Preise reduziert, um die Transportkosten als vielleicht wesentlichen Faktor in der Entscheidung, ob ich am US-Markt aktiv werde oder nicht, mit einzubeziehen. Wir haben dann auch noch einige weitere Firmen interviewt, die wir allerdings anonym hier präsentieren möchten, aber die ein gutes Stimmungsbild abgeben von dem, was man sich hier vor Ort denkt. Das sind zwei Beispiele von Firmen, die aktuell keine direkten Auswirkungen sehen. Einerseits ein österreichisches Maschinenbauunternehmen, die sagen, ja, von der allgemeinen Unsicherheit rund um die Zölle ist man betroffen. Bisher gibt es aber keine direkten Auswirkungen. Die Maßnahme, die man setzt, um Planungssicherheit zu gewährleisten, ist, dass die Incoterms geändert worden, somit das Zollrisiko eben auf den Kunden weitergegeben wird. Ein zweites Unternehmen im Mechatronik- und Automobilzuliefererbereich sagt, sie haben aktuell keine unmittelbaren Auswirkungen, weil eben die Incoterms auf Ex-Works bereits vor den Zöllen festgelegt wurden. Jedoch gibt es spürbare indirekte Effekte, nämlich die gestiegene Vorsicht seitens der Kunden. Es gibt Anfragen zu Cost- und Pain-Sharing-Models, also letztendlich ist irgendwo jetzt schon sind Preisanstiege spürbar durch verzögerte Lieferungen oder erhöhte Preise oder Nichtverfügbarkeit. Und da sagen dann die Kunden des Unternehmens, wir möchten bitte diese Last mit unseren Zulieferern teilen, wir können sie alleine nicht stemmen. Und man spürt bei dem Unternehmen auch ein zurückhaltendes Kaufverhalten der Endverbraucher, das sich auf die Planung und Prognosen entlang der gesamten Lieferkette auswirkt. Die Maßnahme dieses Unternehmens ist, dass man einfach die Situation weiter beobachtet und aktuell keine Maßnahmen setzt. Dann haben wir noch zwei österreichische Firmen, die die Situation negativer einschätzen und größere Probleme sehen. Ein österreichisches Maschinenbau- und Schweißtechnikunternehmen, die sagen, es wird erwartet, dass die Produktionskosten in den USA steigen werden. Daher könnte sich wirklich die Wettbewerbsposition gegenüber US-Herstellern mit lokaler Produktion verschlechtern, da diese weniger stark von den Zöllen betroffen sind. Um an der Stelle wieder auf die Dynamik der Diskussion rund um die Zölle zurückzukommen. Man weiß nicht, auf welchem Niveau sich die Zölle einpendeln werden. Auch das Unternehmen sagt aber, dass einfach eine ganz genaue Beobachtung des US-Marktes das Beste ist, was man in der aktuellen Situation tun kann. Letztendlich wurden bis dato keine Preisänderungen vorgenommen und das Ziel ist es, weiterhin ein tragfähiges Geschäftsmodell in den USA aufrechtzuerhalten und bei Bedarf ausgewogene Maßnahmen zu setzen. Das letzte Unternehmen, das finde ich noch sehr spannend, ist ein Mechatronik- und Automobilzuliefererunternehmen, das eben starke Zurückhaltung bei der Vergabe neuer Projekte beobachtet und die Kunden verschieben Entscheidungen aufgrund der Unsicherheit über künftige Handels- und Zollregelungen. Und trotz dieser Zurückhaltung bleibt man aber zuversichtlich, da eben zwischen der Projektvergabe und dem Serienstart üblicherweise rund 3 Jahre vergehen. Also ein Unternehmen mit relativ langen Zyklen. Und in so einem langen Zeitraum können sich natürlich auch die politischen Rahmenbedingungen verändern. Aus meiner Sicht ist es realistischer, dass sich die politischen Rahmenbedingungen in Hinsicht auf die Zölle, also das Zollregime konkret, wahrscheinlich schon früher verändern werden. Das Unternehmen sagt auch, dass der Standort Mexiko ein zentraler Bestandteil der Strategie bleiben wird. Und das ist auch wieder relevant in Bezug auf die Zölle, die im Handelsraum Nordamerika im Spiel, also in Diskussion standen. Und zusätzlich plant dieses Unternehmen auch eine Eröffnung eines neuen Vertriebs- und Entwicklungsbüros in Michigan, um die Präsenz in Nordamerika weiter auszubauen. Also trotz dessen, dass man die Situation eher problematisch sieht, sieht man in dem Risiko auch die Chance und weitet seine Tätigkeiten in den USA aus. Was sind die Möglichkeiten für die nächsten Tage, die nächsten Wochen? Hier noch einmal zusammengefasst. Ich glaube, was wir konkret empfehlen, ist, viel Kommunikation ist wichtig. Es ist besser, mit anderen zu sprechen und den Erfahrungsaustausch zu suchen, als nur die Schlagzeilen und Nachrichten zu lesen, die eventuell nicht unbedingt hilfreich sind, um konkrete Handlungen für das eigene Unternehmen abzuleiten. Importeure und Spediteure sind eine gute Informationsquelle dazu. Natürlich sind Sie als Unternehmen letztendlich selbst dafür verantwortlich, die richtigen Entscheidungen abzuleiten. Daher hier unter dem QR-Code auch noch einmal die Quelle zum Harmonized Tariff Schedule, wo wirklich die originären Quellen zu diesen Informationen auffindbar sind. Wir als Außenwirtschaftscenter in den gesamten USA unterstützen Sie natürlich dabei, diese Informationen auch zu interpretieren und haben auch einen eigenen Zoll-Infopoint eingerichtet auf unserer WKO.at USA-Seite, bei der wir täglich unsere Informationen zu den Zöllen aktualisieren. Ich glaube, an der Stelle ist es noch einmal wichtig zu betonen, dass auch wenn wir diese Informationen ajour halten, man sich dessen bewusst sein muss, dass sich die Informationen am nächsten Tag bereits ändern können. Und natürlich ist es wichtig, auch mit Zollrechtsexperten zu sprechen. Das tun wir einerseits und versuchen in Formaten wie zum Beispiel diesem Webinar Informationen an Sie weiterzugeben. Ich darf an der Stelle auch noch auf unsere bevorstehenden Veranstaltungen in den USA hinweisen, zu denen wir Sie sehr herzlich einladen möchten. Für alle Unternehmen in der Getränkeindustrie ist der Bar-Konvent in Brooklyn in New York City bei uns das nächste, wahrscheinlich sehr interessante Event. Wir haben weitere Veranstaltungen auch in Boston und in New York. Insbesondere das Bootcamp möchte ich an der Stelle noch einmal erwähnen, bei dem wir österreichischen Firmen, die neu in den Markt eintreten oder die Mitarbeiter haben, die sich jetzt als erstmalig mit dem US-Markt beschäftigen sollen. Dafür haben wir einen einwöchigen Workshop aufgesetzt, bei dem in Person bei uns im Büro Ihre Mitarbeiter mit Experten aus den Bereichen Steuern, rechtliches, Marketing, Kultur und viel mehr sich aus erster Hand Informationen holen können und einen Plan entwickeln können, wie sie in den US-Markt eintreten können. Im September möchte ich nochmal besonders hervorheben unsere Veranstaltung, bei der wir teilnehmen bei der Renewable Energy Conference. Wir haben die Go USA in San Francisco und Boston, speziell für Startups, um sie im US-Markt zu unterstützen. Unsere Future of Investment Veranstaltung, die sich vor allem an österreichische Investoren und Family Offices richtet, um sich einen Einblick in den USA zu holen, wie der Markt im Vergleich zu Österreich funktioniert. Für all jene, die die Möglichkeiten nicht hatten, im Juni beim Bootcamp in New York teilzunehmen, machen wir diese Veranstaltung noch einmal in Chicago und Im Oktober findet auch bereits zum 3. Mal unsere Sportreise statt, bei der wir den US-Sportmarkt beleuchten. Besonders interessant dieses Jahr aufgrund der beanstehenden Großereignisse wie der Fußball-WM und Olympischen Spiele. An dieser Stelle bedanke ich mich ganz herzlich für Ihre Teilnahme und habe hier auch noch einmal die Veranstaltungen und den Infopoint Zölle mit einem QR-Code für Sie versehen. Dieses Webinar wird auch aufgezeichnet und Sie bekommen die Informationen zugesandt. Genau. Ich glaube, an der Stelle sind wir am Ende. Ich danke Ihnen ganz herzlich, wünsche Ihnen noch einen schönen Nachmittag und freue mich auf Ihre Kontaktaufnahme und darauf, Sie vielleicht bei einer unserer nächsten Veranstaltungen begrüßen zu dürfen.